Hello everyone, Bryan here with Test Prep Seminars. Thanks for joining us for a couple of minutes today. So as educators, we are always on the lookout for effective methods and strategies to engage our students. But it's not just about engagement in the moment. We want to utilize strategies that will have a long-term impact on their learning and on their memory and on their retention. Since we only have a few minutes together today, we're going to do a short dive into some concepts and ideas related to both boredom and engagement. After we do that short dive, then I will share with you one of my all-time favorite engagement strategies. In fact, this strategy, while I wouldn't call it top secret, is a strategy that not many educators are using. A lot of us know about it, but not enough of us are using this strategy. And when I share this strategy with you, which you can start using immediately, starting tomorrow with your kids, you'll see a huge jump in engagement and a huge jump in their retention of content as well. So it's an absolute winner. So let's jump on in and take a look at some of the research related to boredom and engagement. We're going to do what I call a 10,000 foot overview. I mentioned before we're going to do a short dive, but 10,000 foot overview, another good analogy. What is it? Why do we need it? And what does it get? We're going to get us. We're going to talk about both boredom and engagement at the same time. So what is boredom? As I jumped in and looked at the research, there are some terms that constantly come together over and over and over again. Take a quick look at this slide and I'll share with you some of the ideas and some of the more interesting things that surface in the research. So we've all been bored, right? It's this natural human emotion, a natural human state. First of all, we need to recognize that boredom is natural, right? It's an emotional condition. You've all been in situations before, whether it be in a formal learning environment or a lecture or in church or in a really long car ride, where you've just been so bored it just took this toll on your emotions, right? Some of us, when we get bored, we get cranky. Some of us, when we get bored, we get silly. Some of us, when we get bored, we get tired, right? There's this emotional toll that it takes on us when we are bored. So the first thing to recognize it is emotion. It's very much an emotional thing when we're bored. It's related to things like my attention span. It's related to the physical fatigue my body might be going through. It's certainly related to what I find interesting or uninteresting. A couple of other keywords to point out on this one is understanding that it's a temporary thing. The brain does not like to be bored, and it won't stay bored for very long. In fact, the longer a student, or any of us for that matter, are in a situation that we find boring, the greater likelihood we're going to find something to engage ourselves. Usually it's going inward and into our own internal mind and thinking, but we'll get into that in just a moment as well. Two other things I want to point out on this slide, pretty interesting, some research that points that for most of us, boredom is a situational thing, right? You put us in an environment or a condition or a context that doesn't meet our needs, that has low relevance or interest to us, and we're situationally bored. Put us in a different situation that does meet our needs, that we do find is interesting and engaging, and you find us engaged, right? So it's very much situational. For the vast majority of it is situational. However, there is some research that points that for some people it's dispositional, meaning it's just part of how they're made up. It's part of their dispositions, part of their kind of makeup, part of their personality. That subset of the population that's dispositionally bored, we have a name for them. It's called men. Actually, hope I hear a bunch of laughter out there. Actually, there is some research that supports that men are more likely to be prone to boredom than women. So those are some of the terms. Back in 2010, I wrote a book called Battling Boredom. It's what started me on this journey. Actually, I started on this journey about being interested in boredom and engagement and the research behind it about 15 years ago. But in 2010, I published a book called Battling Boredom. Here's the definition. It should say a classroom definition, not a classroom boredom, but it's a temporary emotional condition marked by disinterest in whatever the teacher's doing, right? The lecture, the video, the discussion, the task we have in front of us. It's just disinterest. I'm just not into it, right? That's the classic definition, or a classic definition of boredom in the classroom. So just recently here in 2017, I wrote a follow-up to that book called Battling Boredom Part 2, and I had a co-author, Lisa Bradshaw, work with me on this. And as we dug back into the research, there's one change to this definition that I want to make, or that I did make in Battling Boredom Part 2. And that is the word going from may to often, right? So it says a disinterest in the information, context, or events provided by the teacher that may sometimes result in inappropriate behaviors. The more I looked at it, the more I realized how closely boredom is related to behavior. So it's really, as a classroom teacher, if my students are bored, if there's a likelihood, right, that I'm increasing the likelihood of inappropriate behavior. So it's not, it might sometimes happen, it often does. So that's one of the big changes I would make. But our interest is not just in boredom. We want to know about engagement too. But before I do that, here are some other perspectives on what boredom is. I'll let you take a quick read of some of these quotes, some other perspectives on boredom. I love the DeMello quote from 2009. When you're bored, you're just wary and restless due to a lack of interest, or just, the top quote talking about a craving for relief. We've all been in these situations, right? Where with that boredom, when we find ourselves really bored and we can't get out of it, that's the key, right? Excuse me, as adults, when we're bored, if we're in a situation, a formal learning situation that's not meeting our needs, like you're at a national conference, you go into a session and it's just not what you thought, you can vote with your feet. You can get up and walk out, right? Our students can't do that. They don't have the ability to make those same decisions. They know they'll get in trouble if they walk out of your classroom, right? But if you get a chance, check out the boredomlab.org. Interesting website. There's assessments and tools and all kinds of cool stuff out there. I share this with you just because I want you to know there's some really good academic research going on right now on concepts related to boredom. But like I said, our job isn't just to learn about boredom, it's also to know what is engaging or what's engagement. So here's a definition, here are some terms rather, that come up over and over and over again in the research. Take a quick read of that list. Obviously, engagement is related to attention. It's my participation in something. One key word I want to point out, and you're gonna see this on the next slide as well, is this idea of willingness. I'm much more likely to be engaged when I'm willing to take a risk, or willing to take a chance, or willing to do whatever task is in front of me. So back in 2010, I mentioned when I wrote Battling Boredom, not just interested in what boredom is, I want to know what engagement is as well. So here's how I define engagement. It's the state of emotional or cognitive willingness or commitment to do what I'm being asked to do, right? In the classroom, here's the great news for those of us who are classroom teachers. The great news is I don't have to get my kids to love the content nearly as much as I love it, right? If I'm a high school chemistry teacher and I think chemistry is the coolest thing on the planet, nothing's better, I don't have to get my kids to walk out of my classroom thinking, wow, I want to go to college and study chemistry. If that happens, great, we need more chemists, right? But the idea is I need them to emotionally and cognitively commit to whatever task I'm asking them to do, assuming the task is important and relevant and meets their needs, because when I commit to the task, I'm much more likely to engage and then learn and then remember and retain the information. So the good news is we have to just design lessons that get our students to take that step, to commit to try in an important task, which will result in learning. So that's a good definition of engagement. So here we go. Let's continue our 10,000 foot overview now that we have some definitions out of the way. Is school boring? That's the question I ask when I look at the research, and I'm constantly looking at new and new research. Is school boring? Well, let's answer that question. Let's take a look and see what some of the research says. If you're sitting with a partner, if you're taking this webinar with someone else, you see dialogue bubbles up there. I'm going to be quiet for about 45 seconds or a minute or so. Do a quick read of that true-false quiz. The first four are true-false, and there's two fill in the blanks at the bottom. See if you and your partners can guess the answers to those. So go for it. You have about 45 seconds. All right, here are your answers. Let's start with the bottom. Let's reverse it. Let's start with number 5. So boredom and curiosity are among the leading causes of drug use among teens, right? And this makes sense, right? You work with teenagers, you know part of their job is to kind of explore boundaries and push boundaries and do all that kind of stuff. But we do have lots of research that says when students are bored, they're more likely to do those things that you and I as adults would say, hey, that's wrong, or that's not good for you, that's not healthy. Number 4, that's actually false, and all we have to do is turn around one word. People prone to boredom report greater or more incidents of depression, anxiety, and eating disorders. So there is some research that I provide in my full day webinars or my full day sessions on battling boredom that people very much can be bored to death. Is that people who report boredom, greater levels of boredom, have shorter lifespans, but that's for another time. Really interesting information, really interesting research. Number 3 is true, and this makes sense, right? Because if I'm an extrovert, I get my energy from outside myself, from the people around me. And if you put me in a situation where, if I'm an extrovert anyway, where I can't interact with other people and there's low energy, I'm much more likely to tune out. So extroverts are probably going to tune out a little bit quicker than introverts. Man, I let that one slip. Number 2, I let that one slip. I did that on purpose just so you'd have a right answer on one of these. Number 2, men are more prone to boredom than women. That's true. And number 1 is true as well. So this should just get our attention, get our juices flowing a little bit, right, about boredom. So one of the things we need to know is boredom is way more common than we think in our classrooms. Unfortunately so, but when you look at the national statistics, I'm going to show you some here in just a minute, is a lot of our students are reporting being really bored. And that's not good for us. Let me pause for just a minute and answer the question. Why are the quizzes like the one we just did, a short 45-second partner quiz, 5 questions, why are those good for engagement and memory? Let me answer that question first by introducing you to 2 really fascinating people. Dr. Rodiger on the left, Dr. Willis on the right. If you were to make a list of probably the top 10 most influential brain researchers, neuroscientists kind of people in the country, Dr. Rodiger would probably be on that list. He runs the memory lab, you can see there, from Washington University. So he still teaches coursework occasionally, even though he's a researcher. And he says this, right? Every time I'm with students, we do at least 2 things. We take a quiz or a test, and we write. And the quizzes and the tests work because they help develop knowledge, they help to reveal knowledge, they're engaging, they get you to interact with each other, they test your own knowledge. Now quizzes like that are lousy assessments. Don't use them for assessments, don't write them, don't use them for grades. When I mean a formal assessment, don't use them for grades. They're really good informal assessments, and they're fantastic engagement tools. So Judy Willis, she has an interesting story. A medical doctor, practiced medicine for a number of years, and she tells the story that after many years of practicing medicine, she decided to follow her childhood dream, and that was to become a teacher. So she did. She quit her medical practice and became a teacher. And so she's got a fascinating perspective on what we do in the classroom, because she knows the science and she knows the education part of it as well. And she's written a number of books. She's fascinating. Actually, both Dr. Rodiger and Dr. Willis have written several books. They're fascinating people. So let's continue our dive into information regarding boredom and engagement. So the high school survey of student engagement, that's the data you see on the screen. They asked this question. This is done by thousands and thousands of kids. I think over 80,000 students took this survey in 2009. Have you ever been bored in school or in class? And 2/3 of them are saying every day. Ouch, right? That should be a huge eye-opener for us, right? Then that same survey, they asked them, why are you bored? And this is interesting. I'll let you soak up the statistics you see on the screen, but I want to highlight a couple of things that I thought were fascinating from this particular study. The number of kids, 80% of our kids saying the material isn't interesting. Here's part of our struggle as high school educators, right, is a lot of the content we have to teach has future relevance for our kids, but if they're not buying it, if they're not seeing the relevance, that's what matters, right? If they're not buying, you're not selling. If their brains aren't saying, hey, this is important, this is relevant, I need this is interesting, they're less likely to be engaged, and they're much less likely to remember any of the information. So that's pretty sad content, or that's pretty sad feedback for us as educators. What I find even more interesting than the 80% and the 81% are the last 2 bullets. So more kids are saying that the work isn't hard enough or isn't challenging enough, I should say, than they're saying it's too hard. So sometimes we think as educators they're disengaged, they're tuning out, they're opting out because the content is too hard, but more of them are actually saying I'm tuning out, I'm disengaging because the content is not hard enough. It's not challenging enough. So let's continue our look at some of this content. So boredom and engagement. Boredom and dropouts, I should say, rather. Gates Foundation found that of those kids who drop out, half of them are saying, I'm dropping out because school's just not interesting. And that's sad for us, right? I mean, this should be the most interesting place on the planet. School is interesting. I love school, I love learning, but too many of our kids don't have that same response, that same love for learning. And so we're doing something wrong. As educators, we need to address this, right? So is boredom just a high school thing? As I'm looking in all the research and as I'm digging in, I ask that question, is it just a high school thing? So the answer is unfortunately no. Now we don't have a ton of research on young kids, but this particular study found that about 90% of the time in this study with fifth graders, students were just working by themselves, kind of doing individual seat work, whether they be packets or practice sheets or listening to a lecture just by themselves. And that's not what most of your fifth graders would find engaging or interesting, right? Another study, I'm just throwing lots of statistics at you, but this is just kind of to wrap our brains around how important and how big of an issue this is to battle boredom. So a Gallup poll 2012, 500,000 students across 1,700 schools in 37 states found that the older the students get, the greater likelihood that they tune out of school, right? So about 3/4, 75% of our elementary kids are engaged in the life of the school and in the life of the classroom, and that drops to well below half by the time they get to high school. Again, this is what Gallup calls a monumental failure, right? This should get our attention. Then I ask myself the question, well, as we get older, as we become young adults and into college, does it get any better? If you're with your partner, again, lean in and see if you can guess. There's actually two things you need to answer on this screen. One is the percentage. How often is it reported and which reported? So you have to choose A, B, C, or D, and you have to come up with a percentage. I'll give you about 30 seconds to see if you can figure that one out. All right, here's your answer. Let's start with A, B, C, or D. It's actually A, and it's reported in about 40% of all academic situations among college undergrads. So what I think is interesting about that is that's about the same as it was in high school, right? About 40% are disengaged or bored. But when you get to college, especially your junior and senior year as an undergrad, you're starting to focus on all those classes that's your major. That's why you're there. That's why you're paying the money, or someone's paying the money on your behalf to learn this content. But still, a large percentage of our students are saying, yeah, I'm disengaged. Here's another study, another Gallup poll. And they asked they asked a lot of questions on this particular study, but the ones that I thought were interesting is, if a student can report agree or strongly agree to those two questions, my school is committed to building my strengths and I have at least someone around me who makes me excited about the future, they're 30 times more likely to report being engaged in that school. And then Gallup goes on, just talk about the ecosystem that needs to be around our kids. It's not just what we do in the classroom. It's not just what administrators do. It's not just what parents do. It's not just what districts or central office staff does. It's all together. It's all part of this ecosystem. So when we engage kids, great things happen. When they're bored, well, you know the answer to that one, right? If you've not heard of the control value theory of emotions before, let me describe it this way. If I'm in a learning situation, or really any situation, but if I'm in a formal learning situation that I don't have any control over, I don't have any control over who I'm with, how I learn the content, what content I learn, what strategies we do, kind of what I'm involved in, I have no control or very low control, and I don't see any value in it, any inherent interest or any value or any relevance in it, that's what Daniels and Z call the perfect storm of boredom. And we see this all the time in classrooms, right? Is students are told what to do, how to do it, when to do it, and they don't see any value in what they're doing, then no wonder we have a lot of our students who are tuned out. A lot of you probably in your college experiences, your own high school and college experiences, experienced that very thing where you didn't have much control and you really didn't have much interest and you tune out quickly, right? But you can also, here's the good news about that, is you can reverse that. Is you can say, if I'm in a situation where I have high levels or greater levels of control, where I have choice over who I'm with, what I do, how we do it, what our outcomes are, how we express our knowledge, and I'm interested in it, and I see the relevance and the value in it, then that's like the perfect storm of engagement. So the control value theory of emotions, I just try to ask myself those two questions all the time. When I'm putting people in learning situations, do they have some control, and can I help them see the relevance or the value in it? When those two things combine, it's actually pretty hard to stop engagement. I'm going to camp on this one for a second because this research was so fascinating. When I first learned it, I had to laugh out loud. Read what you see on the screen, then I'm going to tell you the story behind this particular research. So that's the question, right? Would you rather be bored or experience physical pain? So this is what these researchers did. This was done on college students, by the way. If you didn't know this, most of the research in psychology and psychological, sociological research done on college students for two reasons. One, they'll say yes to anything and you don't have to get parent permission. So there you go. But this is how they set up this research. Really fascinating. They pulled a series of volunteers in and said, hey, we got an experiment. How would you like to just be alone in a room with your thoughts, right? As educators, you and I are thinking, that'd be like the dream. Give me 30, give me an hour, right? Just me alone, where I don't have people bugging me. I don't have to answer emails. I can just be alone and relax and chill, right? So they took volunteers into a room. It's basically a windowless room, table, chair, nothing on the walls, nothing to read, no electronic devices. They just sat there for 15 minutes alone in a room with their thoughts. They didn't tell them what to think about. They just said, just kind of do whatever seems natural, right? Just relax. The vast majority of people who came out of that experiment said, yeah, I don't want to do that again. And it turns out that it's not a very pleasant experience because the brain does not like to be bored. The brain needs stimulation, right? In so much to the sense, it was only 15 minutes and some of them were reporting, I don't even think I could last 5. It was tough. So they did another variable on this, really interesting. Brought people in, before they went into the room, they had a little electric shock machine, like a static electricity shock. We've all had those before. Not painful, but you pull your hand away back real fast, say, oh, right, that kind of shock. Doesn't hurt you. So before they went in, they let them experience the static the electric shock there on the table. Then they put them into the room alone for 15 minutes with one exception. They weren't totally alone. Another machine was in there that gave them a mild electric shock. And they found that 2/3 of men voluntarily, they didn't have to give them a shock. It was just sitting there on the table. They had to give themselves a shock before they went in, so they kind of knew what it was. So the people who gave them the shock, they knew what it would feel like. But they still did it. 2/3 of men? That's amazing. The brain so hates to be bored, it will endure physical discomfort in order to avoid it. Isn't that interesting? That's kind of a giggle. Women, before you get too judgmental, a quarter of you all did it too, so let's not be too judgmental. Anyway, this just highlights the fact that the brain does not want to be bored and it will find something to do to engage itself. We know, for those of you who might work with at-risk kids, boredom is a risk factor for all sorts of really bad things that you and I say, students, stay away from these things, they're bad. But when they're in an environment where they're bored, whether that environment be home or school or somewhere in the community, they're much more likely to be leaning towards some of those things you see on the screen. And a lot of our students, especially those coming from difficult environments, don't have that internal dialogue or some of those internal skills to deal constructively with boredom. So far I've shared with you lots of sociological and psychological research, but one of my areas of interest is in the brain. So I ask this question: when someone's bored, what's happening in their brain? We have to remember that boredom is an emotional condition. It's an emotional state. And boredom is a stressful emotional condition as well. We don't like it. We will avoid boredom. When someone's in a stressful emotional state, including boredom, there's less activity in the prefrontal cortex. That's the part of your brain right behind your forehead that's involved in thinking and planning and impulse control and reflection, some of the things that kind of make us uniquely human are located right behind our forehead in the prefrontal cortex. So when I'm bored, I have more activity in the amygdala than the prefrontal cortex. The amygdala is part of my brain that processes emotions and emotional control, right? So we've all experienced this, I think, right? You're bored and you become cranky, irritable, or silly. There's an emotional response to being bored, and that's not good. So a lot of those emotional responses don't lend themselves to a well-run classroom. So if you never heard of something called the default mode network in your brain, they measure this through functional magnetic resonance imaging machines, which basically look at blood flow in the brain. And when somebody is in bored, most of us anyway, when we find ourselves in this bored state, the DMN kicks in, and the DMN has been associated with those things that you see on the screen. So in the classrooms, this makes sense, right? We don't always have kids who will be inappropriate when they're bored. We don't always have kids who will be disrespectful or do something overtly inappropriate in our classroom. But we have a lot of kids who will just daydream, right? They'll just tune out. In fact, as adults, that's more likely what we will do when we're in a bored situation. We will tune out, right? We'll go to reminiscing and remembering and thinking about the past. That's the default mode network kicking in. So when you're bored, you're much more likely, a lot of our students are much more likely to go internal with their reflections. And then they're not engaged in learning and they don't have a chance to do well and retain information that you're teaching them in that case. Those people who report boredom have lower levels of dopamine in their brain. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter. Basically, it's involved with feelings of pleasure and bliss. It's a feel-good neurotransmitter. If you've ever heard of it described that way. People who go after illicit drugs or use illicit drugs, illegal drugs, those are usually attempting to hit the dopamine receptors in your brain to make them feel good. So when you have lower levels of dopamine, you're less likely to report being in a good mood. And so no wonder our kids who are bored are much less likely to be very pleasant in our classrooms. So what is engaging? That's the question, right? It's important to know a little bit about boredom, and I set that stage for you just to know that boredom is probably way more common than we want to realize. And it's hard for us as teachers sometimes to realize this because we are engaged. If you're teaching, you're on your feet, you're moving, you're explaining, you're doing all kinds of really engaging stuff all day long. That's kind of why you go home tired and exhausted at the end of the day. So it's important for us to know that from student perspective, boredom is way more common than we think. Well, what's more important is, okay, now, Brian, you got me convinced I got to address this issue of boredom. What is engaging? So back 15 years ago when I started looking into the research and digging a little bit more, here are some of the terms that constantly come up in the research. Take a quick read at this screen and I'll highlight a couple of things for you. First of all, please know that this is not a checklist. I don't want anyone to think that I've got to have all 20 of these things in every lesson I do. No, far from it. When I look at this list and when I reflect on creating learning environments for students, I think of this. The more of these I have in my learning environment, in my lesson, in my environment, and in the things I do with kids, the greater likelihood that they're going to be engaged. For some kids, for example, all it takes is choice. You just need to give them, would you like to complete that task this way, or this way? That's all they need to be fully engaged in the lesson. Other kids just need physical movement. They need to kind of get some energy out and be allowed to stand or do a gallery walk while they're learning. That's, for some kids, all they'll need. So other kids, all they'll need is just a really strong relationship with a caring teacher. Other kids just need the ability to express creativity in the lesson, and that's what it is. So I just look at this lesson and think, the more I have of these, the greater the likelihood of my students engaging. And when they engage, the more likelihood that they remember the content and do well, not only on assessments, but retain information for long term. Before I jump in and share that one home run strategy that I absolutely love, just challenge you to think of it this way. In the classroom, and I have this same philosophy, the same belief, if I'm teaching adults or fifth graders or anybody in between, about every 7 minutes, I want to engage my students in something that's related to a concept you saw on the previous slide of those 20 ideas, right? I'm going to make the commitment that when I'm teaching, my students will not be bored. It will not be an option for kids to be bored in my classroom, because when they are, bad things happen, right? Sometimes those bad things are inappropriate behaviors. Sometimes they're daydreams, but certainly is this. If students are bored in my class, let's remember this. If students are bored in our classes, they're still learning, but they're not learning what we want them to learn. I need to engage them. So about every 7 minutes is what I put in my mind. That's the ideal. That's the goal. So here it is. Finally, after all that time, after about 30 minutes together, here is the strategy. Here's the winner. Here's the home run strategy I want to share with you. The idea is this. As much as possible, put your students in situations where they have to do what a teacher does. That's truly engaging. That's truly going to help with long-term memory and retention. Think about what you do as a teacher. You clarify, you summarize, you elaborate, you explain, you plan, you assess. What you do as a teacher is very difficult, very demanding cognitive work. Again, that's why you go home at the end of the day exhausted, because it's not easy to teach. Doing all those things takes a lot of effort. So I'm going to elaborate more on that in just a moment, but I want to tell you about the research citation you see on the screen there, because this was really interesting, and this is one of the things that really opened up my eyes about the power of being a teacher, or the power of teaching as learning. So this researcher, they took two groups of individuals into a room. They said, let's say group A. They pulled group A in and said, group A, there's some content that I want you to learn. Because you're going to take a test on this content. I believe the original study was on content on the Crimean War. I don't know anything about it either, right? And most people don't. That's why they chose that particular topic. The Crimean War. I think they had an essay to read and they had a video to watch, and they said, here, learn this content, however you're going to learn it, whatever you need to do, because you're going to take a test. And they didn't tell them how to learn it. They didn't tell them how to study. They just said, okay, learn it, you're going to take a test. They took another group in, so we'll call them Group B, and said, here's some content we want you to learn on the Crimean War. We're going to have you watch a video, and there's going to be a reading, and we want you to learn this content because you're going to teach this content to someone else. That was the key variable, right? Is you have Group A that's going to learn it to test it, to test their knowledge. You have another group that's going to learn it because they have to teach that stuff to someone else. So after a certain amount of time, they brought Group A back and said, thank you for doing this. We told you were going to take a test. Here's your test. They pulled Group B back and they said, thank you for doing this. We appreciate it. We told you were going to teach this content to someone else, but rather we're going to have you take a test instead. So we have a group that thought they were going to take a test and took a test. A group that thought they were going to teach it but took a test. They pulled back all the results of the assessment, the test, and they compared Group A and Group B. And who do you think did better on the actual test? Yeah, if it's not Group B, that's a horrible story, Brian, right? Group B did better, but really, if you think about it, the only true variable there was my mindset going in. Again, think about what a teacher does. Think about the mindset you have if you're put in a position where you have to teach. Not only do you have to know some basic definitions and some of the basic facts, but you need to know how to clarify it. You need to know how to give examples of it. You need to perhaps tell a story or analogies. You need to do a lot of pretty sophisticated cognitive things to learn it well enough to teach it to someone else. That's the key idea. So as much as possible, put your students in positions where they do what a teacher does. They have to teach, because a teacher elaborates, explains, clarifies, summarizes, solves problems, does all kinds of really, really deep cognitive things. Before I give you a couple more ideas, let me challenge you to think of this. So here's a challenge question for you. You might disagree with me, but stay with me for a moment. You probably did not learn your content because of your college degree. So I have a degree from Northern Arizona University. I have a degree in history. In fact, I did so well on my GPA, they put a bunch of Latin words on my diploma, right? But I did not learn history until I had to start teaching it to middle school kids. I got good grades in college, passed all my tests, but I did not know history or geography or political science or any of those social studies concepts until I was up in front of a bunch of 7th, 8th, and 9th graders trying to teach concepts. That solidified my knowledge of historical concepts and geographical concepts and political science concepts. What deepened my knowledge was not getting a lot of stuff put into me by my college professors. What deepened my knowledge, what really solidified it, was having to teach it to someone else. So if you're a high school math teacher, got to tell you, your college math classes were probably great. You probably learned a lot, but you probably didn't really know math until you had to start teaching it, right? If I'm teaching 10th graders geometry, that deepens my knowledge. Teaching is learning. Teaching is deepening my knowledge, again, because of what a teacher does. Clarify, explains, elaborates, summarizes, assesses. All of those things are really, really sophisticated cognitive skills. So teaching deepens knowledge. I'm going to give you one more example, and I'm going to give you a couple of other ideas as we pull this session to an end. So I'm going to tell you something, be a little bit vulnerable with you. I hope you don't dislike me when I tell you this, but here it is. I'm a fan of mixed martial arts, MMA. I know it's a little primal, maybe a little bit wrong, but I like watching the competition of MMA. So I was listening to a radio interview with a professional MMA artist who talked about recently opening up his own gym. And he said this categorically. He was absolutely convinced of this. He said now that he was in the position of having to train others, people like you and me walk off the street who don't have any idea about MMA other than what we see on the screen, on TV. And he said, teaching others has made me a better fighter. Same true with your kids. Teaching others will make them better learners. It will solidify their content. Right? Think about what happens when I teach. You and I have all been in this situation, I'm sure, because I was a classroom teacher for a number of years. I remember getting up in front of a group of kids thinking I knew something, right? I read on it, I looked at the textbook, I did my research, I thought, okay, I know this stuff. And then I get up in front of kids and I start to explain it, and I have the old crap moment. The old crap moment is, I don't know this nearly as well as I thought. Right? And that's where you do a quick backpedal to kids, say, oh, we'll finish this lesson tomorrow, right? Think about how powerful that is, and think about what happened in my life when I'm in front of people and I'm trying to explain a concept I don't really understand. I'm going to go home that night and I'm going to research and go like crazy, truly understanding it, because it's embarrassing to be put in a position of not knowing what you're supposed to know. And not that our job is to embarrass kids, but if you ask kids to teach, to explain, to elaborate, to do what a teacher does to other people, and they can't do it, that's self-evident. Then their lack of knowledge becomes self-evident, and that's so much more powerful than as a teacher pointing a finger to a kid and say, you don't know this very well. A kid's pointing a finger at themselves saying, I don't know this very well, right? So put students in situations where they do what a teacher does, and teachers elaborate, clarify, they do all of these really sophisticated cognitive things. That's your key idea. As we wrap everything up here, I want to end with just this one big idea. The more I understand about how the brain works, the more I understand about long-term memory and engagement, I'm convinced of this fact. I keep getting led back to it over and over and over again in the last couple of years. It's not so much about what we pour in, but it's what students pour out. It's less about getting the content into their brains and more about getting the content out of their mouths or out of their fingers via writing. It's about doing something with our knowledge. Really, that's the key idea. We know there's no such thing as a passive recipient, right? Don't get me wrong, what you do as a classroom teacher, the materials they read, the videos they watch, the content they look at, the technology they utilize to interact with that content, those are all really important. So don't get me wrong, I'm not saying they're unimportant. But I think we need to flip the equation, because so often we focus so much of our time on what am I going to do to pour out this information into kids, and we stop there instead of thinking what are the kids going to do to pour that information out of themselves. How are they going to clarify? How are they going to summarize? How are they going to elaborate? How are they going to teach this content to someone else? Right? So for some kids, I'm not a big fan of homework. That's a topic for another webinar. But for some kids, I would say this, look, guys, your homework tonight, just go and take this concept and teach it to someone in your family. I don't care if it's the dog. I don't care if it's the lawnmower. I don't care if you call up grandma who's living across the country, right? Teach, talk, and express your knowledge about this concept, and then we'll talk more about it tomorrow. Because when kids do that, they could videotape themselves on their iPhones, recording them talking and explaining and elaborating. Because when I do that, that is a deep cognitive skill, and it's very, very important. So that's the big idea. Home run strategy, you'll see when you do that, when you put students in situations where they have to teach, Again, we're not talking about, if I didn't say this earlier, let me clarify. What I don't mean about this is taking one individual kid and putting him on the stage and saying, here, you teach the rest of the class. That's not what I'm talking about, right? That's malpractice, and you'll have to reteach anyway. I'm not saying put one student on the stage, because although that one student will be highly engaged, the other 30 kids will be tuned out. So in partners, in small groups, using technology, put students in situations where they have to create, because teachers are creative people, create content to be able to deliver to someone else. That's when we'll see huge gains in their engagement, huge gains in their retention of knowledge as well. So as we come to an end, once again, thanks for spending time with us. I appreciate it. I'm a little biased on this last page. Two of my favorite engagement strategy books and resources are Battling Boredom and Battling Boredom Part 2. So I'm biased there, I'll be totally honest with you. But both of those strategies have just tons and tons and tons of really good engagement strategies in them. So if you want to continue this conversation, if you want to look at 3 or 4 hour webinars, full day sessions, live sessions, webinars, reach out to Test Prep Seminars. Let me know how we can continue to help your journey. So thanks for spending time with us today.